surprised that you didn't know that you were being invited to a wedding today. You are the guests. The bride and groom have yet to show up. I invite you to sign the attendance pads and pass them along the pews. As we gather in worship, what announcements do you wish to share this morning?
So we are raising money for National Junior High Conference this summer, and at lunch we'll have a basket to donate money. Thank you.
Are there any other announcements? Then let us continue in the spirit of worship. Please rise as you are able for the call to worship.
Come away from the valleys of misplaced loyalty. Come, seeking to meet the God of all worlds.
We have come to praise God and give thanks. We believe God's steadfast love endures forever.
We come together that our faith might be strengthened. We seek the strength to live by all we profess.
God's awesome deeds saved our ancestors. Surely God's steadfast love continues with us.
God continues to deliver us in times of distress. God's steadfast love endures forever.
We rejoice that God is near and available to us. We hear God's welcoming us to this time of prayer.
Gracious God, you have invited and welcomed us to this place of worship. You draw us away from the idols we create to take your place. When we come together, we sense that there is nothing in life that can substitute for a vital relationship with you. Yet we are only dimly aware of who you are. All the mysteries of the universe are in your hands, yet you have made yourself known among the people of this earth. We catch glimpses of your work among us and are amazed. We want to meet you again today as for the first time. Touch us, remake us, help us to stand firm in the faith. Amen.
This time the children are invited to go forward.
You see the dress? Yeah, it's a very fancy dress. Do you know what kind of dress that is? You'd wear it for a very special occasion. Do you know what that is? A wedding. Yeah, that's a wedding dress. Beautiful, isn't it? You want to touch it? So, how many of you have ever, I know the answer to this question, but how many of you have ever had a party? How many of you have been to parties? So, what kinds of things, how do you know when there's going to be a party? Well, that's something that's there at a party. How do you know that there's going to be a party? Okay, so an invitation. All right, Gabe, so what are some things that might be on an invitation? Okay, so you could have a picture that tells a theme, but what other things are on an invitation? Pictures, yeah, but things that you need to know. You need to know, it's important to know who it's for, right? And when.
And what day?
What day and what time and where it's going to be. And what else is sometimes is usually on an invitation? A theme, yeah. Do you see these letters here? Down here. What are they? RSVP. What does that mean? Yeah. So, I did have a chance to ask you this earlier, Chrissy, but would you be willing to say what RSVP means, or is?
Sure, it stands for Répondez, s'il vous plaît.
Now you know why I asked Chrissy. and what does that mean literally?
Respond if you please.
Yeah, a number of us knew that part. So should you let them know if you're coming? And should you let them know if you're not coming? Yeah. So I have an invitation here. And it says, you're invited. And for the king's son's wedding. And when is it? And when is it? Today. And what time? Now. And where is it going to be? Here. And for the RSVP, it says, just come. Oh, but there is a note that says, wear appropriate attire. What does that mean? Wear attire? So what is not a tire, but what is attire?
Oh, someone who ties ties.
That would be any tire of a different sort. We should just give up now. What is another word for attire?
A wheel.
A different kind of attire. Maybe Mr. Richard could help us. Could you say what attire is? Clothing. So, what do you think is appropriate clothing for a birthday party?
Yeah, attire.
Depending on the theme, maybe. What do you normally wear to a birthday party?
Attire.
Sneakers, Maybe a dress if it's a fancy one. If you know you're going to be playing games, you might wear something really comfortable.
I wear my legs so I'm like twisted.
So if you went to a wedding, we have a wedding gown and we have a tuxedo here. Do you think that you're all ready to go to a wedding in what you're wearing right now?
No,
What might you change?
them into tires.
Turn them into tires. What might you need to change if you're going to something really fancy? You'd be good just as you are? Well, in just a little bit, you're going to hear a story of a wedding. And someone in that wedding was not dressed as he should have been, or at least as the king thought he should be. So it's important to dress for the right occasion. When we come to church, the most important part of our dressing is the clothing of Christ that we put on.
Well, I'm wearing kind of appropriate stuff for church.
What's most important is that we come with an attitude ready to worship, with a spirit and a heart that are open to the leading of Christ in our midst.
Yay!
So, will you join me? Will you join me for a prayer? Oh God, it is by your invitation that we are here. Perhaps not for a wedding, but to celebrate in the joy of being together as your people. You call us, you invite us, you welcome us, just as we are, no matter how we're dressed. But help us to put on an attitude of faith and worship and love and service and peace, and all of the other things that Christ longs for us to live, as we pray and gather in his name. Amen. So now it's your turn for some story sharing. As you might see in the bulletin, I invite you to share with one or two partners, or to think about it by yourself. What is the most memorable wedding you have attended, and what made it so? So take a few moments to just kind of catalog through weddings that you've attended, and what made one especially meaningful. Maybe your own, maybe a relative's, maybe someone you didn't know very well.
Here.
Okay.
You know, there's about what they wear at a wedding. It probably used to be when they were at church. They would have church food and church clothes.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's funny. It's hard, you know. Yeah. The kids used to, we all used to dress for church clothes. You know, we had our church clothes. Right, but now they're coming in the top. Well, so, you know, well, I guess my hand will hurt.
Actually, my son.
Oh, your son.
Yeah, it was different. That's only 7 years ago.
Oh, 7 years ago.
So that's more recent. But he had a guy that was going to be the best man. And there was some kind of emergency that occurred in the family. He couldn't do it. And so he's wondering, now what do I do? And his wife-to-be said, say, well, why don't you ask your father? Yeah, and he did.
No, that's
and
nice.
he said, would you be willing to do that? Wow, what a privilege.
Yeah.
That was incredibly.
Yeah, that was nice.
Never forget that.
Right, that is.
That was very special.
Yeah, that doesn't happen very often.
No, that's a rare.
I think one that I remember is my that time Korean War was and her husband and that was
Oh.
and he was big and son and they wanted to get married.
Small world.
So that was the most screwed up wedding. Oh, but it was so beautiful and so meaningful.
Yeah, were they dressed in their,
Yeah,
in their,
he did, yes.
yeah, in his, whatever you call their outfits?
But Muriel was such a delightful person, and I was so happy to see her, because I think everybody thought she wasn't going to be married.
Yeah, right, yeah, right.
Yeah, nice. But they had a good life together.
Yeah.
And I often think about that, you know.
Yeah, your children.
All right, now that you've been thinking about weddings,
Yes, we are.
by the way, they're not cheap.
No.
In the parable of the wedding banquet, as recorded in Matthew's account, Jesus tells a story of a king who holds a wedding banquet, but none of the invited guests come. They make light of it, or they mistreat the king's messengers and slaves, even killing them. So instead, the king sends his slaves out to invite everyone on the main streets in. They find people, both good and bad, and fill the banquet hall.
Once again, Jesus spoke to religious authorities in parables. And he said this to them: the kingdom of heaven is like a king who had a wedding banquet for his son. And he sent his servants, slaves, out to those who were invited to tell them to come. But they didn't want to. They didn't want to come. And so he sent more slaves to say to the people, look, the banquet is ready. I have butchered the oxen and the fatted cattle. The food is ready. Come. But they ignored the message and went about their own business, some to their fields and some to their businesses, and some seized the slaves, tortured, abused them, killed them. The king was furious. He got his soldiers and he sent them to destroy the murderers and then to set the city on fire. And then he sent more slaves, saying to them, the ones that I invited before were not worthy. Now you go to the ends of the city and invite everyone. My banquet hall must be filled. And so they went out to the ends of the city, and they invited everyone, the good and the evil. And the banquet hall was filled. Now, the king came into the banquet hall and saw that it was filled. And then he noticed one man who was not wearing wedding clothes. And he said to him, friend, why are you not wearing wedding clothes? The man was speechless. The king said to his slaves, bind him up with his hands and his feet and throw him into the outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. So many are invited, but few are chosen. Love and marriage, go together like a horse and carriage. This I tell you, brother, you can't have one without the
Love and romance and joy and happiness probably come to mind. Even in times where there have been arranged marriages, there's supposed to be an optimism for the future, at least in terms of uniting families. In biblical times, love was not so much part of the equation, but it wasn't supposed to be a time of terror. Something is different about the wedding in this morning's story, in case you hadn't noticed. As you might have gleaned for yourself, there's a lot going on in the story that is odd or downright disturbing. There are parts that seem familiar. If you've ever attended church camp or vacation Bible school, you might be familiar with the wedding banquet song, the I cannot come to the banquet. If you remember that song, you might be thinking that there were some parts of the story that you heard that weren't part of the song. That's because that song is based on Luke's version of this story. They both have a banquet with guests who don't show up, and the host sending invitations to those who are near and far. But there are some major differences. Luke has some folksy excuses. I've bought land, I've bought oxen, I just got married. And the host chooses to invite the poor, the marginalized, those who are outcasts of various kinds of ways. Matthew's version looks like Tim Burton got a hand in it and meddled. An almost whimsical parable takes on disturbing elements and has bizarre twists to it. Then again, maybe it's Matthew that had the original Grimm's fairy tale-esque version and Luke Disney-fied it. Either way, I confess that whenever this story has come up in the lectionary, I have always defaulted to the Lucan version. And if it weren't the fact that I'm committed to following these parables in Matthew, I would have done the same today. But since this is the story that we have, there must be something in this gospel that offers something to say for faith. And amidst the gore and oddness, perhaps there are still lessons for us to learn, if we can find our way through the story. So we begin by hearing that the king was giving a banquet, and it's a wedding banquet. Our first assumption is to make the king God. After all, we think of the church being the bridegroom of Christ, and a wedding banquet feels fitting. The Greek, however, is clear in saying there was a man, a king. We might remember that sometimes things aren't as they seem. Even though we also might have in our head the story from John's Gospel, where Jesus is invited to a wedding and makes it way more fun than it was going to be. For this king and this banquet, for some reason, no one wants to come. It wasn't a day of celebrating love and marriage. It isn't just that they have other obligations that prevent them from accepting the invitation. They make a conscious choice to not be there. Curious. Thinking back to coverage of royal weddings, they're usually the social event of the season. Who would turn down the opportunity to dine with the king? Well, as the story goes on, we might get a sense that the king might not be so beloved and is definitely not such a benevolent ruler. When no one responded positively to the RSVP, the king, via slaves, begged them to reconsider. The food was already prepared, oxen were roasting, the tables were set. All that was missing were the guests. This time, with the invitation, some went off to other activities. Far worse, some of the servants were tortured and killed. Now, we might have reason to wonder about both the king and his subjects. Are these a stubborn, terrible group of people who reject the goodness offered them? Or are they a people who have been beaten down by a tyrannical ruler and in desperation and anger strike the king's messengers? How we answer those questions shape how we view the parable. Although, regardless of how we answer them, we might not approve of the methods or actions themselves. Sometimes violent uprisings are the option of last resort for a people who have run out of other options. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. said that riots were the language of the unheard. I wonder if something similar is happening here. There are sometimes unseen but never forgotten boundaries between those who have and do not have power, those of means and those who are struggling to survive. And a king's power is never long forgotten among his subjects. Whether these people are truly evil or if it is part of a larger rebellion, maybe a protest against the king who used money collected from taxes to pay for this banquet, the king retaliates with the full arsenal of his resources. The country's troops are at his disposal and he sends them out to kill the killers. What's more, the city in which they live is burned. Surely more than guilty parties die in this inferno. One commentator imagined this scene with vivid imagery. As the bride and bridegroom, who never actually make an appearance in the story, are getting ready. The king gathers troops, sets the city on fire, a city that is part of his own kingdom. And while it's burning, the oxen are kept warm on sterno burners. Say what you will about the king, but he can multitask. And when the troops come back from fulfilling their orders, he has a new batch of slaves ready to go out with a new plan in place. With the smell of smoke still in the air, a day of marriage is marked by a king declaring war on his own people. It reminds me a bit of Prince Humperdinck in The Princess Bride. When asked if he wants to watch a new torture device in action, his response is, "I've got my country's 500th anniversary to plan, my wedding to arrange, my wife to murder, and Gilder to frame for it. I'm swamped." Prince Humperdinck and the king in this parable could have shared notes on strategy and plans for conquest. And then the parable takes on a more merciful tone. Because the first invited guests were not worthy, the slaves are sent out to find anyone to take their place. Do whatever it takes to fill the banquet hall. And that's exactly what they do. They invite everyone. The story specifically names that both good and evil are brought in. Whereas Luke frames the story around those who are poor and suffer from infirmities, Matthew's gospel calls out moral diversity. If the parable ended here, it would be much better. No, if the parable ended here, it would be enough to say that our invitation to the great banquet doesn't come from our goodness or righteousness, but the grace of the one who calls us. Christ is our host in this grand banquet beyond the parable. But Christ is also the one who willingly took on the role of servant to meet us where we are and draw us into God's true reign. If the story ended here, however we understand the king, We can lift up this message of being welcomed into a banquet we can never earn our way into, with special status, name recognition, or heroic acts. It's a fitting end to the parable and a reminder that we don't get to determine who is welcome at the table. Other scriptures support that view. And yet the parable isn't quite done with us. Because it turns out there is this parable within the parable. In a story that could stand on its own, the king walks into the banquet hall, at first pleased to see all the people there. They are his subjects, and maybe these guests are grateful to be there, unlike the original ones. But then he notices this one who is not properly dressed. And when questioned about it, he is speechless. By fear or defiance, we don't know. And then he's bound and tossed into eternal torment. Once again, we are left to wonder, what is going on here? Is this what happens if you wear a leisure suit to a royal ball? Since when does Jesus care what people are wearing? To the opposite view, he said we shouldn't worry about what we wear. Why punish someone who's ushered into the hall, maybe didn't have a chance to change? Surely Jesus wouldn't suddenly turn into the upper class who ignored and hated those who were poor. After all, Jesus told another parable about a rich man and Lazarus. In that parable, Lazarus, who dealt with sores and poverty and hunger, ends up with the angels, while the rich man who had ignored him in life suffers in torment. Jesus is a champion of the poor and outcasts. So why draw out and punish someone who seems to represent that demographic? Some commentaries say that it was customary, if a king was giving a banquet, especially a wedding, to provide clothing for the guests. If there is truth to that custom, then maybe the challenge of this part of the parable is that this guest chose not to wear the garment. If so, that relates to the idea that we are all invited to share in celebration with Christ, but it's not enough to simply show up. We must be willing to put on the clothing of Christ and to be more than observers in the calling we have as Christians. A broader lesson on the parable might depend on being able to see not just in this parable or parables, but to see the whole Gospel of Matthew, taking a long view. As parables of strange kingdoms and uncertain forms of justice keep appearing, and will next week as well, we're challenged to keep in mind that the world in which Jesus spoke to his contemporaries was filled with rulers who didn't care for the people. Constantly under pressure from Rome, these leaders were happy to sow seeds of division and violence between groups if it would keep them from rising up against Roman authorities. Discontent was a common feeling. Anger at being invited on a whim and dismissed just as easily might have tapped into the unrest that Jesus' audience felt. They knew of revolts and violent suppression. Matthew's gospel was written after Jerusalem was destroyed in one of these revolts. But for the faith community then and now, there is a banquet to come, one that will include the righteous and the unrighteous. Jesus, instead of leading violent revolt, would offer himself to be bound. And instead of remaining in darkness, he would bring others into light. The parable that is two parables is ultimately bound to the whole of the gospel, where at the end the resurrected Jesus commissions witnesses to go into the world to bring good news. And like the final list at the wedding banquet, it is a diverse group. True believers and some doubters are brought together. They're not subjects of Jesus' wrath or dismissal. Instead, each one is sent, not as slaves, but as ambassadors for a banquet yet to come. Now that is one RSVP worth responding to. Oh, and bring a friend. There's plenty of room.
God invites us to invest our time and resources in ways that build rather than destroy, in work of lasting value rather than temporary distraction. Through the church, we seek to offer a quality of life focused on the worth of every individual, of justice for all and excellence in all things. May our offerings and our lives praise God. Let us pray. May our offerings help to prepare many to feast at your banquet table. May our generosity reflect the amazing abundance you entrust to our care. As we find joy in giving, may others be inspired to give their best, and may all of us realize your peace, dwelling within and among us as we serve in Christ's name. Amen.
God, it is by your invitation that we are here. Whether or not we realize it, whether it came through someone else's invitation, whether it came from a desire to seek something deeper or different in life, whether it came from just stopping by or something internal, it is your Spirit that draws us together and makes us one body. We praise you for inviting us, for calling us as we are, for transforming us by your Spirit, for helping us by faith to weather storms, by joining us as sisters and brothers to offer prayers together and to be extensions of your hands and feet. Continue to guide us, continue to help us to discern and understand who you call us to be as individuals in a body. Help us to be willing to put on the garments of your Spirit in our words and our actions. Let us act with humility and gentleness, with compassion and love, and let that be extended to all whom we meet. Let our compassion be big enough to fill the spaces where there is hurt and loneliness. May your peace replace the violence that we hear around us. Sustain us, guide us, lead us. Draw us into celebration with you. And Lord, as we prepare to share together in a fellowship meal, not a wedding banquet, but a brunch, or if we find that we have to go other places, bless the food that we eat. Help us to be mindful of the hands that prepare it. Help us to be grateful for the company that surrounds us. In all that we take in all that we offer, let us live as your people. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
presence be known. May our invitation be held and experienced and responded to. May we live as people of Christ's